The words cut through the air of the Chicago penthouse like a blade, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. Sheikh Omar al-Mansouri stood in his marble foyer, his expensive suit impeccable despite the late hour, watching as Maria Santos gathered the scattered contents of her purse from the floor, where his security guard had dumped them. Her 8-year-old daughter Sophia pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face, clutching a homework assignment about American immigration that had started this entire confrontation. "Speak Arabic if you're truly from here," Omar had said, when Maria tried to explain that her daughter was working on a school project about Middle Eastern culture, that they had been researching his homeland of Jordan for a presentation. His assumption was clear. This woman and her child were frauds, opportunists trying to gain sympathy or access by claiming connection to his heritage. The irony was lost on him in that moment of rage, that he was demanding proof of authenticity from people whose very presence in his home he saw as an intrusion. Sophia looked up at him with eyes that held more dignity than fear, wiped her tears with the back of her small hand, and began to speak. The Arabic that flowed from her lips was not the broken textbook phrases he expected, but the fluid, melodic dialect of the Levant, spoken with the particular accent of someone who had learned it not from books, but from bedtime stories and lullabies. "Odile, my grandmother Fatima told me that home is not a place you can lose, but a language you carry in your heart," Sophia said in perfect Arabic, her voice steady despite her tears. She said that when people try to make you prove who you are, you should remember that your roots grow deeper than their understanding. The silence that followed was deafening. Omar felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he processed what he had just heard. This child, whom he had dismissed as another American kid playing dress-up with Middle Eastern culture for a school project, spoke his language with a fluency that rivaled his own. More than that, she spoke it with the wisdom of someone who understood its deeper meaning. Maria stepped forward, her chin raised despite the humiliation of the last 10 minutes. Sophia's great-grandmother was Palestinian, from a village near Jerusalem. She came to America in 1948, but she made sure her language and stories survived in our family. "My daughter has been bilingual since she could speak." Omar stared at them both, feeling something cold and uncomfortable settling in his stomach. He had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming neglected neighborhoods across the Midwest into thriving communities. His success had come from his ability to see potential where others saw only problems, to recognize value that others missed. Yet here, in his own home, he had failed spectacularly at the very skill that had made him wealthy. I apologize," he began, but Maria was already guiding Sophia toward the door. "We'll finish the research project another way," Maria said quietly. "Sophia, say goodbye to Mr. al-Mansouri." Sophia turned back, her small face composed with the particular grace of children who have learned too early that the world can be cruel and arbitrary. "Ma'a salama," she said in Arabic. "Go in peace." 3 weeks later, Omar sat in his downtown Chicago office, staring at a newspaper article that had been forwarded to him by his publicist. The headline read, "8-year-old school project wins National Award for Cultural Understanding." Below it was a photo of Sophia Santos standing beside a detailed display about Palestinian-Jordanian immigration to America, her smile bright despite the bandage on her arm from a recent fall. The article detailed how Sophia had overcome initial research challenges to create a presentation that traced her family's journey from the Middle East to Chicago, incorporating interviews with elderly community members, historical documents, and traditional recipes. Her teacher was quoted praising the project's depth and sensitivity, noting that Sophia had demonstrated remarkable maturity in handling complex topics of displacement and identity. Omar read the article 3 times, each pass making him feel smaller. The initial research challenges were clearly a diplomatic way of describing what had happened in his penthouse. This child had taken his rejection and transformed it into something beautiful and meaningful, finding other sources for the information he had refused to share. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, your mother is calling from Amman." Omar's weekly call with his mother was usually a source of comfort, but today her voice carried an unusual tension. "Omar, Habibi, I saw something troubling on the news. A story about a little girl in Chicago who was researching our culture for school. The reporter mentioned she had difficulty finding community members willing to help her." Omar's throat tightened. "Mama, This child, she has Palestinian roots, and she speaks Arabic?" "Yes. And no one in our community helped her." "Omar, what kind of people have we become in America that we turn away children seeking to understand their heritage?" The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Omar heard little beyond his mother's disappointment. She spoke about the responsibility of those who had found success to lift up others, about the importance of preserving culture through the next generation, about the shame of allowing pride to override compassion. After hanging up, Omar sat alone in his office as the Chicago skyline darkened outside his windows. The city stretched out before him, a patchwork of neighborhoods he had helped develop, communities where families like the Santos family lived and worked and dreamed. He had spent years building physical structures, but he was beginning to realize he had neglected to build the human connections that gave those structures meaning. That evening, Omar drove to the address he had found in the school directory, a modest apartment building in Pilsen, a neighborhood he knew well from his development work. The building was one he had considered purchasing and renovating, but had ultimately passed on because the profit margins were too slim. Now, seeing the peeling paint and broken security door, he wondered what other opportunities he had missed by focusing solely on financial returns. Maria answered the door with obvious surprise and wariness. Behind her, Omar could see Sophia at a small kitchen table, working on homework under the warm light of a table lamp that had seen better days. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, what are you doing here? I came to apologize properly and to ask if Sophia would be willing to teach me something." The request was so unexpected that Maria's defensive posture softened slightly. "Teach you what?" How to see my own culture through her eyes. How to remember why preserving our heritage matters more than protecting our pride. Sophia looked up from her homework, studying Omar's face with the careful attention children give to adults whose intentions they're trying to decipher. "Are you here because of the newspaper story?" "Partly," Omar admitted, "but mostly because I realized I made a terrible mistake. I let my assumptions blind me to who you really are. My teacher says assumptions are like wearing sunglasses indoors," Sophia said seriously. "They make everything look different than it really is." Over the next hour, sitting at that small kitchen table while Maria served tea in mismatched cups, Omar learned more about his heritage than he had remembered in years. Sophia showed him her project materials, interviews with elderly Palestinian and Jordanian immigrants, recipes handwritten in Arabic by community grandmothers, photographs of families who had rebuilt their lives in America while maintaining their cultural identity. But this woman, Sitamina, she taught me how to make mahamul," Sophia said, pointing to a photo of an elderly woman with kind eyes. "She said the secret ingredient is remembering the hands that taught you. Every time you make the cookies, you're connected to all the women who made them before you." Omar studied the photograph, recognizing something in the woman's face that reminded him of his own grandmother. "Where did you find her?" "At the community center on 18th Street. She comes there every Tuesday for the senior lunch program." She was so happy when I asked her about the old country. She said young people don't usually want to hear the old stories. The weight of missed opportunities settled heavily on Omar's shoulders. He had lived in Chicago for 15 years, had built a business empire in this city, yet he had never visited the community center Sophia mentioned. He had never sought out the elderly immigrants who carried the stories he had forgotten, never thought to connect with the very people whose experiences had paved the way for his success. "Sophia," he said carefully, Would you be willing to introduce me to Sit Amina? I think I have some learning to catch up on. The following Tuesday found Omar in an unfamiliar part of his own city, walking through the doors of the Pilsen Community Center with Sophia as his guide. The building was old but well-maintained, filled with the sounds of multiple languages and the smells of diverse cuisines. In the main hall, elderly men played backgammon, while women shared stories over traditional dishes from their homelands. Sophia led him directly to a table where Sit Amina sat with several other elderly women, their conversation flowing seamlessly between Arabic and English. When Sophia introduced Omar, he saw recognition flicker in the old woman's eyes, not of him personally, but of the type of person he represented. "Ahlan wa sahlan," Sit Amina said formally, welcoming him in Arabic. "Sophia tells me you are from Jordan." "In what city?" "Amman," Omar replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his expensive suit in this room full of people who understood the value of things that couldn't be bought. "Ah, the capital. I have cousins there. And what brings you to visit us simple people?" The question carried layers of meaning that Omar was only beginning to understand. "And I came to learn," he said honestly. "I realized I had forgotten important things about where I come from." Sit Amina studied him for a long moment, then gestured to an empty chair. "Sit, then. Learning requires listening, and listening requires time." What followed was 3 hours that changed Omar's understanding of his place in the world. He listened to stories of displacement and resilience, of families who had lost everything but their language and traditions, of children who had grown up between cultures and found strength in that complexity rather than confusion. Sit Amina spoke about her journey from a village outside Bethlehem to Chicago, about working in factories while raising 5 children, about the importance of passing on traditions to grandchildren who were more American than Palestinian, but needed both identities to be whole. "The young ones today," she said, glancing fondly at Sophia, "they understand something we sometimes forget. Culture is not a museum piece to be preserved unchanged. It is a living thing that grows stronger when it is shared, when it adapts, when it welcomes new voices." As the afternoon wore on, Omar found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years, about his grandmother's garden in Amman, about the smell of jasmine in the evening air, about the way his mother used to sing him to sleep with old Bedouin lullabies. The memories felt rusty from disuse, but they came back with surprising clarity in this room, full of people who understood their value. When it was time to leave, Sit Amina pressed a container of homemade ma'moul into his hands. "For your mother," she said. "I tell her they are made with the recipe from the old country, but with love from the new one." That night, Omar called his mother in Amman, describing his afternoon at the community center, while the taste of Sit Amina's cookies lingered on his tongue. His mother listened without interruption, and when he finished, her voice was warm with approval. "Ya Omar, you have found your way back to something important. Your father, may he rest in peace, used to say that success without connection to community is just expensive loneliness." Over the following months, Omar became a regular visitor to the community center. He started small, funding a new sound system for the main hall, sponsoring a cultural festival that celebrated the neighborhood's diversity. But gradually, his involvement deepened into something more personal and transformative. He began offering business mentorship to young immigrants starting their own companies, drawing on his experience in real estate development to help them navigate the complexities of American entrepreneurship while maintaining their cultural identity. He established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, with Sophia as one of the first recipients despite her young age, an investment in her future education that came with no strings attached, except the hope that she would continue building bridges between communities. Most importantly, he started listening. In weekly gatherings at the community center, he heard stories that challenged his assumptions about success, about identity, about the responsibility that came with privilege. He learned about families struggling with gentrification in neighborhoods he had helped develop, about young people caught between their parents' expectations and American opportunities, about elderly immigrants who felt invisible in a city that had grown around them. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. There were moments when Omar's old instincts kicked in, when he found himself making judgments based on appearance or accent rather than character. But Sophia, who had become an unlikely mentor despite their age difference, had a way of calling him out with gentle directness. "Mr. Omari," she said one afternoon when he had dismissed a young man's business idea too quickly, "my grandmother Fatima used to say that wisdom often comes disguised as foolishness, and foolishness often wears the clothes of wisdom. Maybe you should listen longer before you decide." The rebuke stung because it was accurate. Omar was learning that true cultural understanding required not just celebrating traditions, but examining the prejudices and assumptions that had calcified around them. He had to confront the uncomfortable truth that his success had insulated him from the very community whose struggles had shaped his family's journey to America. 6 months after that first encounter in his penthouse, Omar stood before the Chicago City Council, advocating for a zoning change that would preserve affordable housing in Pilsen rather than allowing luxury development. The proposal would cost him personally. He owned several properties in the area that would be worth significantly more if rezoned for high-end condominiums. "Well, this neighborhood is not just real estate," he told the council members, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned to see beyond profit margins. "It is home to families who have built their lives here, who have created community here, who deserve to stay here as the city grows around them." In the audience, Maria Santos watched with surprise and something that might have been pride. Beside her, Sophia took careful notes for a new school project about civic engagement and community advocacy. The zoning change passed by a narrow margin, but the real victory was smaller and more personal. After the meeting, as Omar walked through the neighborhood he had chosen to protect rather than profit from, he stopped at a small restaurant where the owner, a Jordanian immigrant named Khalil, greeted him in Arabic and insisted he try the mansaf. "I heard what you did today," Khalil said, setting down a plate of the traditional dish. "My family has been here for 20 years, and we were afraid we would have to move when the rent started going up. You could have made millions, but you chose to protect us instead. Why?" Omar thought about the question as he tasted the mansaf, the familiar flavors connecting him to memories of family gatherings in Amman. "Because I learned that some things are worth more than money. Because a little girl taught me that preserving culture means preserving the communities where culture lives." A year later, Omar stood in the gymnasium of Sophia's elementary school, watching her present her latest project to a room full of parents and community members. Now 9 years old, she had grown in confidence and curiosity, her natural intelligence nurtured by the educational opportunities Omar's scholarship fund had provided. Her presentation was about successful community development models, featuring case studies from Chicago neighborhoods where economic growth had been balanced with cultural preservation. She spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed these changes firsthand, who understood that progress didn't have to mean displacement. "The key," Sophia explained to her audience, "is making sure that the people who live in a community get to help decide how it changes. When developers and residents work together, everyone benefits." In the audience, Omar felt a complex mix of pride and humility. This child had taken the lessons he was still learning and articulated them with a clarity that eluded many adults. She had become not just a beneficiary of his philanthropy, but a teacher whose insights continued to shape his understanding of responsible development. After the presentation, as families mingled over coffee and homemade pastries, Sitamina approached Omar with a knowing smile. "But that child has a gift," she said, nodding toward Sophia, who was explaining her research methodology to a group of impressed parents. "Not just for learning, but for seeing connections that others miss. She's taught me more than I've taught her, Omar admitted. That is how it should be. The best teachers are always students, and the best students become teachers. You have learned this, Alhamdulillah. As the evening wound down, Omar found himself in conversation with Maria, who had been watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something more complex. Not quite friendship, but a mutual respect built on shared investment in Sophia's future. She wants to study urban planning when she grows up, Maria told him. She says she wants to help cities grow in ways that honor their history while creating opportunities for everyone. She'll be excellent at it, Omar replied, watching Sophia carefully pack up her presentation materials. And she already understands the most important principle, that development without community input is just gentrification with better marketing. The observation came from hard-won experience. Over the past year, Omar had restructured his entire business model, shifting from pure profit maximization to what he called community-centered development. The approach was more complex and sometimes less profitable, but it had resulted in projects that strengthened neighborhoods rather than displacing their residents. His latest project was a mixed-use development in Pilsen that included affordable housing, small business spaces for local entrepreneurs, and a community center that would serve as a hub for cultural programming. The design process had involved months of community meetings, where residents like Sit Amina and business owners like Khalil had equal voice with architects and investors. And it takes longer this way, Omar had explained to his initially skeptical business partners. But what we build lasts longer too, because it has the support of the people who will live and work there. The proof was in the results. The Pilsen project had become a model for inclusive development, attracting attention from urban planners across the country who wanted to understand how to balance economic growth with community preservation. Omar found himself invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing lessons learned from a 9-year-old girl who had challenged his assumptions about culture and belonging. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. At the annual Eid celebration at the community center, Omar was approached by a group of young Arab-American professionals who had heard about his work. "You've changed how we think about success in our community," one of them told him. "You've shown us that we can honor our heritage while building something new, that we don't have to choose between tradition and progress." The comment stayed with Omar long after the celebration ended. He had set out to make amends for a moment of prejudice and poor judgment, but the journey had transformed his entire understanding of what it meant to be successful, what it meant to be Arab American, what it meant to be part of a community rather than just living in one. 2 years after that first encounter in his penthouse, Omar received an invitation that surprised him. Sophia's school was hosting a cultural heritage fair, and she had asked him to be a guest speaker about Jordanian traditions and their evolution in American communities. Standing before a room full of children from dozens of different backgrounds, Omar felt the weight of responsibility that came with being seen as a cultural ambassador. These kids were looking to him for wisdom about navigating identity in a complex world, about maintaining connections to heritage while building new homes in America. "Culture is not a costume you put on for special occasions," he told them, thinking of the lessons Sophia had taught him. "It's not a list of foods or holidays or traditions that never change. A culture is a conversation between the past and the present, between the place your family came from and the place you're building your life." He spoke about his grandmother's garden in Amman and Sit Amina's kitchen in Chicago, about the way recipes traveled across oceans and evolved in new kitchens, about the importance of listening to elders while also trusting young voices to carry traditions forward in new ways. "The most important thing I've learned," he concluded, "is that culture belongs to everyone who claims it with respect and understanding. It doesn't matter if your Arabic is perfect or if you know all the traditional dances. What matters is that you care enough to learn, to listen, to contribute something meaningful to the ongoing story. After his presentation, Sophia approached him with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Mr. Omar, do you think my project helped change your mind about things? Or were you already ready to change?" The question was more sophisticated than her years suggested, touching on issues of agency and influence that many adults struggled to understand. Omar considered it carefully before answering. "I think I was ready to change, without knowing it," he said finally. But you gave me the push I needed. And more importantly, you showed me what change could look like. Sometimes we need someone else to see our potential before we can see it ourselves." Sophia nodded seriously, as if filing away this insight for future use. "My teacher says that's what good education does. It helps people become who they already are, but better." As the fair continued around them, with children sharing stories and foods and traditions from around the world, Omar reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a successful businessman who had forgotten his roots, had become someone who used his privilege to lift up others while rediscovering his own identity in the process. The transformation hadn't been without cost. Some of his old business associates had questioned his new approach, arguing that he was leaving money on the table by prioritizing community input over maximum profit. A few had ended their partnerships, unable to understand why he would choose complexity over efficiency. But the rewards had been immeasurable. His company was now seen as a leader in sustainable, community-centered development. His personal relationships had deepened as he learned to value connection over status. Most importantly, he had found a sense of purpose that went beyond accumulating wealth. If stories of cultural rediscovery and community building resonate with you, consider how you might bridge divides in your own neighborhood. Sometimes the most profound changes begin when we examine our assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. When we choose to listen rather than judge, when we recognize that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. That evening, as Omar drove home through the streets of Chicago, he passed the community center where he had first learned to listen, the restaurant where Khalil served traditional food to a diverse clientele, the apartment building where the Santos family lived in a neighborhood that was growing without losing its character. Each location represented a choice he had made to prioritize community over profit, connection over isolation, growth over gentrification. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother in Amman. "Saw the article about your speech at the school. Your father would be proud. You have remembered that success is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others." As he pulled into the garage of his penthouse, Omar thought about the journey that had brought him full circle. He had started in this same building, in this same apartment, but he was no longer the same person who had demanded proof of authenticity from a child whose roots ran deeper than his understanding. The penthouse itself had changed too. The marble foyer now displayed artwork from local artists, including a piece by Sophia that depicted the Chicago skyline with Arabic calligraphy woven through the buildings like golden thread. His library included books in multiple languages, stories that reflected the diversity of the community he had learned to be part of rather than separate from. Most significantly, the space was no longer a fortress of isolation, but a gathering place. Once a month, he hosted dinners for community leaders, young entrepreneurs, and families like the Santos family who were building bridges between cultures while creating new definitions of success. Tomorrow, he would meet with architects about his next development project, a mixed-use complex in another Chicago neighborhood where long-time residents were worried about displacement. The process would be long and complex, involving months of community meetings and compromise. But Omar had learned that the best solutions emerged from collaboration rather than imposition. He had also learned that the most important question wasn't whether he could afford to prioritize community needs over maximum profit, but whether he could afford not to. The cost of isolation, of disconnection from the very people whose struggles had made his success possible, had proven far too high. As he prepared for bed, Omar reflected on the unexpected teacher who had set him on this path. Sophia was now 10 years old, thriving in an accelerated academic program while maintaining her connection to the community that had nurtured her curiosity. She still visited Sitamina every Tuesday, still asked questions that challenged adults to think more deeply about their assumptions, still carried herself with the particular grace of someone who knew that wisdom could come from anywhere if you were willing to listen. The scholarship fund Omar had established in her honor now supported over 50 students, but Sophia remained its most important success story, not because of her academic achievements, but because of her ability to see connections that others missed, to build bridges where others saw only walls, to remember that culture was a living thing that grew stronger when shared. In his final moments before sleep, Omar offered a prayer of gratitude that had become his nightly ritual. He thanked God for the humbling experience that had taught him the difference between success and significance, for the community that had welcomed him back despite his initial arrogance, for the child who had shown him that authenticity wasn't about proving where you came from, but about honoring where you were going. The words that had once been weapons, speak Arabic if you're truly from here, had become a bridge to understanding that home wasn't a place you had to defend, but a feeling you could create anywhere people chose to welcome each other with open hearts and minds. And in that transformation, Omar had found not just redemption, but a new definition of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in the depth of connections that made life meaningful. If you've been moved by this story of cultural rediscovery and community building, consider supporting organizations that help immigrant families preserve their heritage while building new homes in America. The next time you encounter someone whose background differs from your own, remember that the most profound conversations often begin with curiosity rather than assumptions, with questions rather than judgments. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply the willingness to listen and learn from perspectives that challenge our own understanding of what it means to belong.